My fiancé betrayed me.
You don't even know who I am.
You looked at me like I mattered.
Then marry me before you change your mind.
You married my son for the Voss name. I married the son you threw away. You know nothing about this family.
She knows me better than you ever did. 6 years, Cassidy. I forgot how this felt.
One more step, come to me.
I'm standing because you never gave up.
No, Nathan, you chose to stand.
The guests were still laughing when Cassidy Harmon walked out of her own engagement party. She had found Marcus in the coat room with her coworker, and she had not screamed. She had simply turned and walked through the ballroom while 200 people watched with their phones raised. Outside, in the parking garage, a man sat alone in a wheelchair, watching the exit like he had been waiting for something. He wasn't. But she stopped in front of him anyway, and on the worst night of her life, with champagne still on her dress and her ring still on her finger, Cassidy Harmon asked a stranger to marry her. He said yes. The video had 4 million views by morning. Every comment said the same thing: she had lost her mind. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that the man in that wheelchair was worth more than everyone in that ballroom combined. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 6 months earlier, Cassidy had believed the hardest thing about her life was choosing a wedding venue. The Hartwell Room at the Grand Solace Hotel had been Marcus's idea. 200 guests, a jazz trio, a champagne tower, and a catering bill that Cassidy had quietly helped offset with 3 months of overtime. She hadn't mentioned the overtime. Marcus was particular about things like that, about the image, the balance, the way it looked from the outside. She had learned, over 6 years, to be careful about what she mentioned. She had believed, until 9:14 on a Saturday evening, that she was happy. The coat room was at the end of the north hallway, past the restrooms, behind a door with a brass handle. She had gone to retrieve her phone charger from her wrap. She had opened the door without knocking because it was a coat room, not a private room, not a room where anyone had any reasonable expectation of. She didn't finish the thought. She looked at the 2 people on the other side of the door. She recognized both of them. She closed the door. Then she stood in the hallway for 11 seconds. She counted later, because she needed something concrete to hold on to, and then she went back through the ballroom. She did not cry. She did not stop. She moved through the crowd with the focused clarity of someone who has suddenly been given an instruction so simple that following it is the only thing left. Someone called her name. She didn't turn. Someone else touched her arm. She kept walking. She pushed through the heavy door to the parking garage, and the cold November air hit her face and she breathed. The garage was mostly empty at this hour. A few valets near the entrance. A town car idling near the far wall. And a man in a wheelchair, maybe 30 feet from the exit, sitting alone beside a concrete pillar with his hands folded in his lap, watching the door like he'd seen enough of what was on the other side of it. Cassidy stopped. She wasn't sure why. He wasn't what she would have noticed on any other night. Medium height in the chair, dark jacket, a face that had something watchful in it, not cold, exactly, but careful, like someone who had learned to observe a room before deciding whether to enter it. He looked at her the way people don't usually look at strangers in parking garages, openly, without awkwardness, like he saw her, and wasn't pretending otherwise. "You've been sitting out here a while," she said. She didn't know why she said that either. Long enough to watch 3 people come out that door crying and go back in. He paused. "You're the 4th. You're also the only one who didn't go back in." She looked down at her hands. The ring on her left hand caught the fluorescent light. She was still holding her clutch. She couldn't remember picking it up. I found my fiancé," she said, "in the coat room. With someone I work with." He didn't say anything. He didn't make the face people make when they're composing a response. "Everyone in there still doesn't know," she said. The jazz trio is probably still playing. And I'm standing in a parking garage and I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." She looked at him. Something shifted in her chest, not a feeling she had a name for. but a kind of recognition of something she couldn't articulate. This man, whoever he was, had been sitting out here in the cold instead of going back inside. He understood in some way she didn't have the language for yet. What it meant to have decided that inside was no longer where you belonged. The laughter from a knot of guests spilling out of the venue floated into the garage. Someone had their phone up. Someone was saying her name in a tone that made it a joke. Cassidy looked at the man in the wheelchair. She made a decision. She walked toward him and stopped 2 feet away, and before she could think about it enough to stop herself, she asked, "Will you marry me?" He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't laugh. "You don't know me," he said. "I could be the worst thing that's ever happened to you." "I already met that today," she said. "I don't think you can be worse." Another pause. The phone lights were getting closer. Someone near the garage entrance was already filming. "My name is Nathan," he said, "and my answer is yes, but the laughter that erupted from the bystanders was loud and immediate. Someone shouted something about a charity case. Someone else said she'd finally lost it completely. One woman called out that she hoped she liked pushing wheelchairs, and the people around her thought that was very funny. Cassidy didn't turn around. She crouched down in front of Nathan's chair, on the level of his eyes of us. She held out her hand, the one without the ring, and he took it. His grip was steady. His eyes didn't waver. That night, after the crowd had gone back inside and the video was already uploading across 4 platforms, Nathan made a brief call to someone named Leo. She heard only the end of it as she walked back to collect her coat. "Cancel my 7 o'clock. Something has come up." And from the other end, a voice, quiet, professional, unremarkable, said, "Of course, Chairman." 3 weeks later, Cassidy Harmon signed her name on a marriage certificate in a room that smelled like floor wax and old paper. The witnesses were a woman named Patrice, Cassidy's neighbor and only friend present, and a man named Leo, who wore a suit that cost more than Cassidy's rent and gave nothing away in his expression. The ceremony took 11 minutes. When it was over, the clerk stamped the certificate and slid it across the counter without looking up from his computer. Patrice hugged her in the elevator. Leo shook Nathan's hand and said, "Congratulations, sir," in the tone of someone confirming a shipment. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in a quiet part of the city, functional, clean, the kind of space that told you the person living there had made deliberate choices rather than settled for what was left. Nothing expensive, but nothing neglected. Books on the shelves in a specific order. A kitchen that had been used. A window that looked out over the street where the afternoon light came in at a useful angle. Nathan had given her the bedroom. He slept in a modified setup in the 2nd room, which he'd had arranged for accessibility. He showed her the apartment the way someone explains the rules of a shared space to a new roommate. "Here is the kitchen. Here is a shower knob runs out cold before it adjusts. Here is the building's maintenance number. The elevator goes out on the 15th of the month," he said. "Every month. I don't know why. I've stopped asking." "I'll remember that," she said. She made dinner that first night. Nothing elaborate, pasta, the kind that comes together in 20 minutes with what's in the cabinet. Nathan watched from the kitchen doorway. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask him to, and later she would understand that there was something in that first negotiation that set the terms for everything that followed. "You should know what you've married," he said, when they sat down. She waited. "My family, the Voss family, has money, real money. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You'll hear the name around certain circles." He moved the fork to the side of his plate in a small, specific way. 5 years ago, I had an accident. A car accident on the interstate. Fire. These legs. He said it plainly, without the quality of performance that the statement usually invited. A family like mine can forgive many things. It has more difficulty with a broken showpiece. So they settled me with a monthly allowance and this apartment, and asked me to maintain what they called a low profile, far from their circles. Cassidy looked at him across the table. "So what you've married," he said, "is a monthly allowance, a quiet street, and a man who cannot stand to greet you. I want you to understand that before this goes any further." She considered the weight of what he'd said, the casualness of it, the careful precision of a man who had practiced delivering this information without inflection, Is that everything? She said. Isn't it enough? It's more than I came with, she said. Now eat. Your food's getting cold. He didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted. The first night she heard it was 3 days later. The apartment was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives in cities only after 2 in the morning. She had been asleep, almost, when she heard it, a sound from the other room that took her a moment to identify. Controlled, suppressed. A man in pain who had learned to make that pain as small as possible, because there was no one to hear it, and even if there had been, he would not have allowed himself to be heard. She lay still for a long time. She didn't knock on his door, not that night. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood, without being told, that the door Bimbo closed was a specific and deliberate choice, and that walking through it uninvited would be a violation of something she didn't yet have the right to breach. She thought about it instead, about the accident. About 5 years of nights like this one. In the morning, she asked him, carefully, about treatment. Specialists. Rehabilitation. The family doctor signed off on the assessment when I was discharged, he said. The damage to the lumbar nerve roots is, according to 3 separate consultations, permanent. There's management, pain medication, which I use as minimally as possible, and there's acceptance. There's also new research, she said. There's also enough movement in peripheral nerve regeneration in the last 3 years. He looked at her. You've been researching. I read last night when I couldn't sleep, which was true. She didn't mention the other part, that she had lain awake listening to him suppress what the dark brought, and that the research had started as something to do with her hands when she couldn't do anything else. He said he appreciated her interest. His voice was careful and closed. She let it go for now. That afternoon, while Nathan was in his second room with the door shut, working, Cassidy's phone rang. Patrice. Marcus has been calling around, Patrice said. Mutual contacts, your old colleagues. He's telling people you had a breakdown, that you're not well. He says the man in the wheelchair is Cass. He's saying you married someone with a mental illness, that you were manipulated. That's Invin. Are you okay? I mean, actually. She looked at the door at the end of the hall. She thought about a sound she hadn't been meant to hear, and a man who had delivered the terms of his diminishment with the steadiness of someone who had made peace with something they shouldn't have had to make peace with. I'm better than I was 3 weeks ago, she said. That was accurate. That evening, she was looking for a pot in the lower cabinet when she passed behind Nathan's position at the kitchen table. He had a laptop open. She wasn't looking. She genuinely wasn't. But the subject line of the email on the screen was large enough that she couldn't avoid it. Vos Capital Group. Q3 Board, Off-Fortune Child Chairman, signature pending. She kept moving to the cabinet. She found the pot. She said nothing. But she stood at the stove for a long time afterward, thinking about a word she'd heard in a parking garage 3 weeks ago, delivered by a man in an expensive suit who had the bearing of someone accustomed to deferring to a specific person. Chairman. She turned the burner on. She let the water heat. Some things, she understood, revealed themselves on their own schedule. The call went through at 2:17 in the morning, 3 days after the courthouse wedding. Nathan had waited until he was certain Cassidy was asleep. The apartment had a specific quality of silence when she was, something settled, a different weight to the air. He had noticed it earlier than he expected to. He dialed Leo's direct line, Meridian Realty Group. He said, when Leo picked up, "How many active contracts do they hold with Voss Capital Partners and subsidiaries?" A pause, brief, the kind that meant Leo was pulling a file rather than thinking. Directly and through 3 intermediary partners. 11. Haulage, commercial leasing, a construction referral agreement, and the East Side Development financing arrangement. Combined value, roughly $4.1 million annually. Terminate all of them. Another pause. This one was longer. Before business opens Monday morning, invoke the breach clauses where they exist. Their regulatory filings show falsified compliance documentation on 3 of the construction contracts. Use it. And Leo, Nathan kept his voice level. Freeze their credit lines with the partner banks quietly. Let them wake up inside what they've built. It will be done, Chairman. A beat. May I ask what changed? Nathan looked at the closed door of Cassidy's bedroom. He thought about a woman walking through a ballroom with her back straight while 200 people lifted their phones. They threw away a diamond, he said, and kept the glass. Tonight, the market corrects itself. Good night, Leo. He ended the call and sat in the dark for a while. Marcus Webb arrived at Cassidy's building on a Tuesday afternoon. She saw him from the window first. The specific way he walked, shoulders slightly forward, a rehearsed casualness that she'd once found charming and now recognized as performance. He'd driven himself rather than taken the car service, which meant the meeting was personal rather than the kind of thing he wanted a record of. She went downstairs. He was standing on the sidewalk when she came out, hands in his coat pockets, his expression arranged into the particular configuration she had also once found difficult to resist. Repentant, earnest, privately suffering. "Cass," he said. "Marks, I need to talk to you. You are talking to me." He looked at the building behind her. She watched him register the neighborhood, the ordinary street, the small hardware store across the road, the lack of doorman, the lack of anything that would put this address inside the geography of his expectations. He didn't say what he was thinking. He had enough sense for that. Instead, he ran the full sequence: apology, tears that gathered at the corners of his eyes without quite spilling, a talent she'd never asked him to develop. Diane was a mistake. It happened twice, and then it didn't happen again. He had been under enormous pressure from the firm's expansion. Stress does things to a person. "You know that's not who I am," he said. "You know me, Cass." 6 years. 6 years, she agreed. "And you threw it away for—" He stopped himself. He looked at the building again. I didn't throw anything away," she said. "I found something worth keeping. Those are different." He took a breath. He recalibrated. The second performance was softer. He still loved her. She was making a decision in crisis. He would wait. He wasn't asking her to come back today, just to think. "I have thought," she said. "I thought about it in the garage while everyone was filming. I thought about it for the 3 weeks after I've finished thinking. Cassidy." His voice shifted. Something underneath the performance moved. That man, in the wheelchair. "You don't know who he is. You don't know what you married. His family settled him with an allowance because he can't function. That's what my contacts tell me. He's nothing, Cass. He's less than nothing. And you? Go find out what's happening to your contracts, Marcus," she said. "I think you'll be very busy this week." He didn't understand the comment. He tried to read it as an insult. He settled on that interpretation, nodded once with the dignified anger of a man who has not yet registered that the ground has already shifted, and walked back to his car. Cassidy went upstairs. 4 hours later, she heard him on the phone from the other end of the building. She was visiting a neighbor who had a working ice machine, and the voice she heard through the wall was not the controlled, measured voice of a successful real estate developer. It was panicked. It was asking questions that had no good answers. Why were all 11 contracts terminated simultaneously? Who authorized the bank action? What breach clause? There was no breach clause. There had to be an error. She went back to her apartment and made dinner. Nathan was at the table when she came in, laptop closed. "You went downstairs," he said. "Marcus came by." He looked at her. There was something watchful in it. Not jealousy, which would have been simpler, something more like bracing. "He's not a problem," she said. "He won't be back." Nathan nodded once. He didn't ask what was said. She didn't offer it. They ate. That night, she heard his phone buzz on the kitchen counter while he was in the other room. She wasn't trying to see, but the screen lit face up, and the message was there before she could look away. From Leo. "Meridian has been neutralized. Also, Mrs. Marcus Webb has retained an investigator. Current inquiry appears focused on Mr. Voss's residential address and prior movements. Recommend standard protocol." She put a glass down on the counter carefully. She turned the faucet on and let the water run. Standard protocol. Recommend. The word chairman again in a different sentence. She stood at the sink for a long time, watching the water, turning something over in her mind that she was not yet ready to name. Evelyn Voss arrived on a Wednesday morning without warning. Cassidy opened the door to a woman in a cashmere coat who had the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves in her presence. She was perhaps 60, with a particular kind of composure that came not from serenity, but from decades of choosing which emotions were worth allowing onto one's face. Behind her stood a man with a leather portfolio, the attorney, Cassidy understood without being told. "You must be her," Evelyn said. Cassidy stepped back from the door. "Mrs. Voss, please come in." Evelyn moved through the apartment with measured steps. She looked at the kitchen, the shelves, the window, the modest geometry of every choice in the room. Her expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of expression. Nathan came from the second room. He stopped in the hallway when he saw his mother. "Mama," he said, flat, not surprised. "I had intended to give you longer," Evelyn said. She sat without being invited to in the chair nearest the window and crossed her ankles. "But the photographs from the parking garage are still circulating, and I've received 3 calls from the Harrington family and 2 from the Caldwells this month. So I've decided the conversation cannot wait." She looked at Cassidy then, a long, specific look, the kind that takes inventory. "The Voss name has stood in this country for 4 generations, she said. "My son's grandfather built the first fund in a 2-room office in 1962. Governors have been in our dining room. The work of rebuilding that name after my son's accident has been considerable. A great deal has been managed carefully." She paused. "A woman from nowhere, married in a parking garage, who has no family background, no relevant connections, and a recently broken engagement that is documented on 4 social media platforms. That is not what careful management looks like." Cassidy had been standing near the counter. She moved slightly, until she was standing between Evelyn and Nathan. "Mrs. Voss," she said with respect, "you may say whatever you need to say about me. I've heard worse from people who at least knew my name first." She kept her voice level. "But you will not stand in my husband's home and call him a liability. This man that your family settled with an allowance and asked to disappear, he is worth more than that arrangement. And the arrangement is over." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "She has a spine," Nathan said from behind her. Something in his voice was difficult to read. Evelyn stood. She said what she came to say to Nathan. The family had discussed his situation. The public visibility was a problem. Compliance was expected. A conversation about restructuring the allowance arrangement was necessary, and then she left. The attorney followed without having spoken a word. The door closed. The silence in the apartment afterward was thick. Nathan stayed in the hallway. Cassidy moved to the kitchen. She kept her hands busy. "She can't tell you what to do," Cassidy said. "I know. Your life is here. Whatever they arranged 5 years ago, Cassidy," she stopped. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been researching rehabilitation specialists." It wasn't a question. She had left a browser tab open and on the shared tablet they'd started using for grocery lists. She hadn't hidden it because she hadn't thought to. He had seen it. She turned around. "Yes, I don't need you to find me an exit," he said. His voice was careful and controlled. "I told you what this marriage is. I was explicit." "You were," she said. "And I'm being explicit now. I wasn't researching an exit. I was researching you." He didn't believe her. She could see it, the particular closing off she'd been watching happen in increments when a subject got too close to something he'd learned to protect. "Go back to what you were doing," he said. He went to his room. The door closed. The lock, a quiet, definitive click. Cassidy stood in the kitchen. She breathed slowly. She thought about what it cost a person to carry pain for 5 years in locked rooms, and what it cost them to trust that someone standing on the other side of those doors was not going to use what they found there. In the morning, she took the bus to a rehabilitation clinic that had been recommended in an article she'd found at 2 a.m., 3 weeks earlier, on nerve injury management. She explained who she was there for and what the situation was. The physical therapist who saw her spent 2 hours showing her techniques, specific, exact, useful things she could do with her hands. Deep tissue mobilization along scar bands, positions and angles. What would hurt before it helped? She listened and learned everything. She came back at 8 that evening. She stood outside Nathan's door. She knocked. No answer. "I know you're there," she said. "I also know you can hear me, so I'm going to say this once. She put her hand flat against the door. "I spent 12 hours at a rehabilitation clinic today. Dr. Kim, the head of neuromuscular recovery, showed me 3 hours of technique. The bus was delayed twice and I missed lunch. That is where your wife was. A pause. The door can stay closed if you need it to, but you should know what was on the other side of it. Silence. Then the lock clicked. He opened the door. He looked at her, her hands, her face, the specific tiredness that came from a day of learning something difficult because you decided it was necessary. "Show me," he said. She did. That night, for the first time, Nathan slept through the part of the dark that usually woke him. Cassidy sat in the kitchen afterward, her hand still carrying the warmth of the work she'd done, and allowed herself to feel, very quietly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know, yet, that the appointment she'd made at the clinic had put her name on a waiting list that Leo had been tracking for 6 months on Nathan's behalf, quietly without mentioning it. She did not know that the modest allowance that Nathan had described as his income was a fiction so precisely constructed that it had taken 3 attorneys to draft. She did not know any of it. She knew her husband's hands had relaxed, finally, in the dark. She decided that was enough for tonight. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered. It was addressed in a handwriting that Nathan recognized before he turned it over, his grandmother's script, the particular slant that had written his birthday cards every year without fail, even the years when the rest of the family seemed to consider his existence a clerical inconvenience. He read the note inside. Then he laughed, briefly, which was not something Cassidy had heard before. She looked up from the table. "My grandmother," he said. "She wants us to attend her annual gala." He read the relevant line aloud. "If you fail to bring your wife, I will come to that apartment and sit on the stoop until the neighbors begin asking questions." "She would do it," he added. "She has done it to my Uncle Gerald twice. She considers it a reasonable form of persuasion." "When is it?" 3 weeks. Cassidy looked at her hands. She thought about what was in her closet and what wasn't. Patrice came over that weekend and sat on Cassidy's bed while Cassidy went through the possibilities. There were not many. The one dress she owned that was close to gala-appropriate needed alterations at the waist and a different neckline. Patrice pinned the fabric while Cassidy held still, and they talked through the arithmetic of what was achievable versus what it would cost to start over. "You know women at these things wear gowns that cost more than your security deposit," Patrice said. "Then they're wearing their security deposits," Cassidy said. "I'll wear my own hands." She spent 2 evenings reworking the dress, not because she had to, but because the act of making something with her hands had always been the thing she did when she needed to find out what she thought about a situation. By the time she was done, it was hers in a way that something purchased wouldn't have been. Leo arrived on the evening of the gala with a car. Quietly expensive, nothing conspicuous. Nathan was in the hallway when Leo entered, dressed in a jacket Cassidy hadn't seen before, the kind of understated quality that she was beginning to recognize as the consistent register of everything in his world. He looked at her. "You made the dress," he said. "Not a question. I altered it. It's good." He said it simply, without performance. She had learned, in 6 weeks of marriage, that he didn't give compliments he didn't mean. In the car, he told her things she would need to know. The family dynamics, his grandmother's authority, the factions, who to be careful with. His Uncle Gerald would be there, his father's brother, the one who had taken on the administrative role in the family's public-facing activities after Nathan's accident. His mother. Various board-adjacent figures who had the conversational habit of trying to gauge what you knew about things they hadn't told you. "You don't have to perform," he said. "You don't have to be anyone except who you are. The only thing I'll ask is, your head stays up when we walk through that door," Cassidy said. "Whatever else happens, that's the only thing I care about." He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. The Voss family's annual gala was held at a venue that had been in the same family for 3 generations and looked it, the kind of room that accumulated history through use rather than display. Casa registered the architecture, the flowers, the quality of the light, and the particular way guests moved in spaces where money was assumed rather than announced. She also registered Marcus. He was near the far end of the room with Diane, wearing a tuxedo that she recognized, and a smile that was working too hard. He was in a conversation with a man in a Voss Capital name badge. He hadn't seen her yet. Nathan had been absorbed almost immediately by a cluster of older guests, people who knew his grandmother, and had questions that Cassidy couldn't decode without more context. She stayed near him until she understood she was not needed there, and then moved gradually toward the garden. It was cooler outside, quieter. She was standing near a stone bench when she heard a voice behind her. "You're the one who proposed in the parking garage." She turned. Ruth Voss was perhaps 80, small and deliberate in the way of people who have learned to use space rather than fill it. She wore a dark dress and a ring that caught the garden lights. Her eyes were Nathan's eyes, the same watchful quality, the same refusal to look away from what they were looking at. "Yes, ma'am," Cassidy said. "I'm that woman." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, at her hands, at the altered dress, at the particular way she was standing. "They say you came with empty hands," Ruth said. "My hands weren't empty," Cassidy said. "They were full. It's just that nobody in that parking garage could see what I was carrying." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and removed the ring from her own finger, slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman who has made this decision before she arrived. "This ring has been in this family since before I was born," she said. "My grandmother wore it. I wore it. It goes to the wife with the strongest hands." She held it out. "I've been looking for those hands for 30 years. I believe I've found them." Cassidy held still. Ruth placed the ring in her palm and closed her fingers around it. Inside, behind the glass doors of the main hall, Marcus stood very still. He had turned and found himself looking at Ruth Voss, the matriarch, the one name in the family that actually carried weight, closing Cassidy's hand around a ring that anyone in the room would recognize. He looked at Nathan in his wheelchair, speaking quietly with two men whose names were on the building across the street. He looked at Diane. "Find out," Marcus said, low and urgent. "That man in the wheelchair. Find out who he actually is." Diane found Leo near the bar. She was good at this, at appearing casual, at making a question sound like the natural continuation of something already underway. She commented on the venue, mentioned that she and Marcus had attended a few Voss Capital events in a professional capacity, asked if the company had expanded its real estate portfolio recently. Leo listened to all of it with the expression of someone who had been trained specifically for this situation. "Mr. Voss is a private individual," he said. He smiled, the kind of smile that ended conversations. Diane was persistent. She mentioned Nathan directly, gently, with fabricated sympathy. The phrasing women learn when they want information from someone who has decided not to provide it. Leo set down his glass. He looked at her. Voss Capital Group was founded in 2001. The current chairman has held the position since he was 27, and the company has operated continuously in that structure. He paused. "If Meridian Realty Group has any outstanding questions about the termination of their contracts, they should address those in writing to the legal department." "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Diane went back to Marcus. She said 2 sentences. Marcus's face changed. He looked across the room at Nathan, at the wheelchair, the jacket, the way the man in it was talking to Ruth Voss with the ease of someone who had grown up in this particular quality of air, and something in him underwent a rapid and devastating recalibration. Marcus started across the room. Cassidy had come back inside from the garden. She was standing near Nathan when she saw Marcus coming, a direct line through the crowd, his expression stripped of the careful social management he usually maintained. Several guests stepped back instinctively. Ruth Voss stood beside Cassidy. She did not move. Marcus stopped in front of Nathan. "You," he said. His voice was not steady. You're the one who destroyed Meridian. You were in that parking garage, you heard everything, and then you came after my company." The room had gone quiet in the specific way of a room full of people who have learned to pay attention while appearing not to. Nathan looked at Marcus. He didn't lean back, didn't shift his position, didn't do anything that would suggest the need to create distance. "I'm sorry," Nathan said. "You are?" Marcus's mouth moved. "I believe," Nathan continued, "that Meridian Realty Group received formal termination notices citing documented compliance violations on 3 construction contracts." The breach clauses were invoked under the standard agreement. If you're disputing the documentation, I'd suggest your legal team review the regulatory filings from 2022 through 2024. He paused. I don't remember hearing anything about your company being owed a different outcome. You knew. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. You knew who I was, and you, Mr. Webb. Nathan said the name with a kind of deliberate unfamiliarity, as if trying it out. I knew who my wife was when she walked out of that ballroom. That's the only thing I knew. Ruth stepped forward. She was shorter than Marcus by a significant margin, and it didn't matter at all. My grandson, she said, in a tone that did not rise in volume, but would have been audible in the next room, is the chairman of Voss Capital Group. He has held that position for 6 years and will continue to hold it. She looked at Marcus with the mild curiosity of someone examining an object of modest interest. If you have a professional grievance, Mr. Webb, you are welcome to submit it in writing to the company's general counsel. Their office hours are posted on the website. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Cassidy looked at Nathan. He was looking back at her. He had been looking at her for the last several seconds, she realized. Not at Marcus, not at Ruth, at her, watching her face while she processed. She held his gaze. She thought about a parking garage in November, and a man who had said yes when she gave him no good reason to, and 6 weeks of unlocking things carefully in the dark. She thought about all the things she had seen and catalogued and not yet named, and how they arranged themselves now into something that made a certain kind of complete sense. She nodded, once, small, just for him. His expression shifted in a way she was not sure anyone else in the room would have read as significant. The crowd absorbed Marcus and Diane in the way crowds absorb people who have been publicly reduced. They moved. The conversation around Nathan and Ruth resumed. Leo appeared at Nathan's shoulder and leaned down. Sir, Leo said, very quietly, the original mechanic from the accident site, he's agreed to talk. Nathan's hands were still in his lap. Cassidy watched him process what Leo had said. She watched the stillness that followed, not peace exactly, but the particular quality of a decision that has been waiting for years for the right moment to become available. He looked at Cassidy. She was still there. Leo, he said, we'll discuss it tomorrow. Of course, sir. The gala continued. Ruth stayed close. Marcus left early with Diane, and the room settled into the ordinary rhythms of an evening that had briefly hosted something larger than itself and was now returning to its proper scale. On the drive home, the city moved past the windows in long strips of light. Cassidy held Ruth's ring in her palm, not wearing it yet, just holding it. Nathan was quiet beside her. How long? She said. He understood the question. The chairman role? Since the year of the accident. I continued the work remotely through Leo, through a restructured system. It was the one thing they couldn't take, the allowance. Was accurate in the sense that I do receive a family allowance. It's a very small portion of my income. A pause. I understand that's a significant omission. She thought about it. She thought about the laptop, the word chairman, the termination of 11 contracts, the morning. After Marcus came by, the way Leo moved through spaces that cost money without ever looking surprised by them. You tested me, she said. It wasn't an accusation. I've been tested by people who knew exactly who I was, he said. I wanted to know who you were when you had no reason to stay. She looked at the ring in her palm. She looked out the window. And, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You went to a rehabilitation clinic for 12 hours, he said. You argued with my mother in my hallway. You drove 3 hours to find a specialist when you thought money was a constraint. He paused again. You stayed. She put the ring on. Then we're even, she said. The car moved through the night. The city didn't know what had happened. The mechanic who was ready to speak didn't know yet what Cassidy was about to put in motion. Gerald Voss didn't know that the conversation he had spent 6 years preventing had been confirmed by a man named Leo in a room with 300 witnesses. But the woman in the car did, and the man beside her did, and the space between them, which had been careful and watched and full of locked doors, felt different now, not without weight. Just navigable. Together. The apartment felt different when they got back, not in any way Cassidy could have pointed to specifically. The furniture was the same. The light from the hallway came through the same gap under the door. The elevator still smelled like the building's particular combination of old carpet and someone's nightly cooking. But something had been moved in the structure of their arrangement, and both of them felt it. Nathan made coffee. This was new. He had never made it before, had always waited for her, or made do. She sat at the table and let him. He set a mug in front of her and sat across from her. He looked at the ring on her hand and looked away. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. "I need to now." She waited. Leo mentioned the mechanic tonight. He turned the mug by its handle, a small, repeated motion. "I told you it was an accident, the car accident, 5 years ago." That was what the official report concluded. Mechanical failure. Brake system. Cassidy was still. "The brakes didn't fail," he said. "They were cut." The mug was on the table. The coffee was hot. Neither of them touched it. Leo was told by a mechanic, a man who worked for a garage that was contracted by my Uncle Gerald, that the work was done 3 days before I drove that car. Gerald wanted the chairman position. My father had made it clear it would go to me. Gerald decided the most efficient solution was to make that conversation unnecessary. He said it without particular emotion, which was itself the most revealing thing about it. "And your family," Cassidy said. "Your mother?" There was a file. Photographs from the scene, a witness who worked at the same garage, financial records showing a payment from Gerald's personal account to the contractor. That evidence wasn't solid enough to convict without the mechanic's testimony, but it was enough for a civil case, enough to open an investigation. He paused. My mother made the assessment that a criminal proceeding inside the family would collapse the Voss name, the trust structures, the charitable board positions, 3 generations of work. She decided the cost of that was higher than the cost of what Gerald did. The mechanic was paid and relocated. The file was sealed. Gerald was asked to step back from the operational role, which was the only consequence, and I was asked to carry the rest of it. For 5 years, Cassidy said. For 5 years. She sat with this for a long time. The clock on the wall made its small sound. Outside, a car passed. "They asked you to protect the family name," she said finally. "With your own body, with your legs. It's more complicated than, it's exactly that simple." He didn't argue. She stood up from the table. She moved to the counter and stood there with her back to him for a moment. Not because she needed to hide her face, but because she needed to make a decision before she turned around. When she did, she was calm. "I want the file," she said. "Everything Leo has. The mechanic's testimony, the photographs, the financial records, every piece of it, Cassidy." "I'm not asking, Nathan. I'm telling you what I'm doing." She met his eyes. "I married you in a parking garage with nothing in my hands. I have learned to do your physical therapy in a room where you lock the door. I have carried myself through your mother's living room and your family's gala, and 6 weeks of understanding, slowly, that the man I married is worth more than the arrangement he was forced into." Her voice was steady. "Gerald Voss ordered someone to cut your brake lines, and you were asked by your mother to swallow that so the family wouldn't be embarrassed. I'm not going to watch that stand." Nathan was quiet. "Whatever it costs," she said. "However long it takes, he answers for the interstate. They asked you to protect the Voss name. I'm going to make that name protect you, or I will take it apart myself." She meant it. He could tell, not because she was loud about it, but because she was the same register of person who had gone to a clinic for 12 hours and come home and knocked on a locked door. She meant the things she said. She had no apparent mechanism for saying things she didn't mean. He pulled out his phone and called Leo. He said, "Give her everything." Leo said he would. Then Leo said, "One other thing, sir. Gerald sent a text while you were in transit. He's been informed the mechanic has agreed to talk." Nathan looked at Cassidy. She held his gaze. "Handle it," he said to Leo, standard legal protocol. "And Leo, I want the U.S. Attorney's Office aware of the file by tomorrow morning. Not as a complaint, as a disclosure of available evidence." He ended the call. The apartment was quiet. "Thank you," Cassidy said. "He's my uncle," Nathan said. "I've sat in the same room with him at Thanksgiving for 5 years. I've watched him drink my grandfather's wine and give toasts at weddings." He stopped. "I told myself I wasn't ready, that the timing wasn't right, that the company needed stability. And now?" He looked at his hands, then at hers. The ring was there, Ruth's ring, the one that went to the strongest hands. "Now I have someone who will build the case with me," he said, "and I've spent enough years carrying this alone." Her phone lit up on the table. She turned it over, a text from a number she didn't recognize. It was from Gerald. She read it once. It said, "I understand you've been speaking with certain people about family matters. I'd encourage you to remember that some doors, once opened, don't close comfortably." She showed it to Nathan. He read it. He handed the phone back. "Good," he said. "Now he knows." She put the phone face down. She picked up her coffee, which had cooled to exactly the temperature she preferred. She drank it. Some things could not be threatened into silence. Gerald, she thought, had not yet understood that. He would. Nathan raised it 3 days after the gala, in the morning when they had finished breakfast and the table still had dishes on it and neither of them had moved to clear them. "You are 28, he said. She looked up. "The Voss name is visible now. Every door it opens is open to you, professionally, socially, whatever you want from it. Men with full use of their legs will be in the rooms you're about to enter. Men who can stand next to you at your best moments and not require management." He kept his voice even. "I do the mathematics on that every night. I want you to know I do it, and I want you to know that I understand what the numbers say." She looked at him for a moment. She set down her fork. "Are you finished?" she said. "Cassidy, because that's the last time I want to hear it." She met his eyes without difficulty. "I didn't marry your legs, Nathan. I married your eyes in a park-eyeing garage on the worst night of my life. I married a man who told me the truth about his situation before he had any reason to trust me. I married the person who, 6 weeks later, opened a locked door." She paused. "Your mathematics is wrong. Not because I'm not calculating, I am, but you've put the wrong variables in." He was quiet. "I told you I was going to end your pain," she said. "I didn't know how, I still don't know exactly. But I've found something." She slid a paper across the table. "Dr. Harlan Cole, he's a retired neurosurgeon. He left conventional hospital practice 8 years ago to work with a small clinic about 2.5 hours from here. He doesn't advertise, he doesn't take referrals. He decided, after 30 years of being told what patients couldn't do, that he was more interested in what they hadn't tried yet." Nathan looked at the paper without touching it. "I drove there 3 weeks ago," she said. "Before the gala. I explained your situation. He said the imaging from 5 years ago was taken in the immediate post-trauma period, when the nerve damage was at its most acute presentation. He said there's been meaningful advancement in regenerative nerve protocols in the last 3 years. He said the verdict it isn't necessarily final." She paused. "He also said he won't see a patient who hasn't decided to engage with his own situation." Those were his words. Nathan looked at her. "I made the appointment for Friday," she said. "If you want it." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You drove there thinking money was the obstacle. I drove there because you were worth the drive regardless of the obstacles." He looked at the paper again. She watched him, the familiar internal mathematics, the same calculation she'd seen him run since the first night, the one where he arrived at the conclusion that the costs exceeded the returns and managed the deficit by never starting the investment. "Friday," he said finally. "Friday," she confirmed. Dr. Harlan Cole's clinic was a converted farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. Inside, it was clean and functional, and completely without the particular institutional quality of places that had accepted their patients' limitations as facts rather than parameters. Cole himself was in his late 60s, lean, with the unhurried manners of someone who had stopped measuring his days against a schedule that didn't belong to him. He looked at Nathan for a long time before speaking. "How long have you been locking this door?" Cole asked. Nathan said, 5 years. And in 5 years, Cole said, "How much has the pride healed?" He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way a man who has been doing a specific kind of work for 30 years asks a question he already knows the answer to. 1 toe? Half a toe? Cole. Nathan's voice had an edge. "Your wife drove here alone," Cole said. "She explained your situation to a stranger. She made an appointment for someone who hadn't agreed to come. She told me, when she sat in that chair," he gestured to the chair by the window, "that you would either tell her she'd overstepped or you'd get in the car on Friday." He looked at Nathan. Is your pride heavier than the weight of what she's been carrying alongside you? The room was very quiet. Nathan's hands were in his lap. Cassidy watched them. Low. Then when Cole waited, "No, nothing I have is heavier than that." "Good," Cole said. He stood. "Then we'll begin." The treatment protocol was long. Not weeks, months, possibly a year, with uncertain endpoints. Cole was clear about this in a way that conventional medicine rarely was. He named the uncertainty alongside the possibility. And the combination felt more honest than the clean negatives Nathan had received years before. The process would involve interventional approaches that were not yet standard practice, combined with the physical therapy work Cassidy had begun, and a set of daily commitments that Cole described in language that left no room for half measures. Nathan listened to all of it. He said yes to all of it. In the car on the way back, he was quiet for a long stretch of highway. Cassidy drove. "You still thought money was the problem," Nathan said. "It's usually the problem," she said. It wasn't. "I know that now." He looked at the road. "I would have paid for the best specialists in thrombectomy," he said. "I have, over the years. They all said the same thing." "Cole didn't," she said. "No." A pause. "Cole didn't." Her phone rang through the car speakers. "Leo." "The evidence file is prepared," Leo said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office received the disclosure this morning. They've confirmed receipt and opened a preliminary inquiry." A pause. "Gerald has retained the Harrington firm." "Good," Cassidy said. She glanced at Nathan. "And when will Gerald know that the preliminary inquiry means his retained counsel needs to advise him on the specific risk profile of a cooperation agreement versus the alternative? I expect his attorney will have that conversation with him by end of week." "Good," she said again. Nathan was watching her. "What?" she said. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about a lot of things since November." She changed lanes smoothly. "You spent 5 years carrying something you shouldn't have had to carry alone. It's going to take more than a phone call to fix that, but it's going to get fixed." He said nothing for a moment, then. "Cassidy." "Yes. Thank you." She kept her eyes on the road. "Don't thank me," she said. "Dance with me eventually. When you're ready." She didn't look at him, but she was smiling. "That's the only payment I'm interested in." Gerald Voss arrived at Nathan's office building on a Tuesday morning with his attorney and a carefully prepared posture of injured dignity. Nathan received him in a conference room on the 14th floor, not the chairman's office, not the lobby, a conference room, which communicated something precisely. Leo was present. 2 of Nathan's lawyers were present. Gerald's attorney had been given the file 3 days before the meeting, which meant Gerald had spent 72 hours reading documentation that described, in specific and sourced detail, what he had ordered done. Gerald tried several approaches in sequence. The first was that the evidence was incomplete. The second was that the situation had been mischaracterized and required context. The third was that the family suffered enough and a private resolution was in everyone's interest. The fourth, the one he arrived at around 40 minutes in, when his attorney put a hand on his arm, was a kind of stillness, the particular quality of a man who has run out of useful options. "I want the record," Nathan said. He said quietly, without theater. "Your admission on the record. What you ordered, and why. Not for a courtroom, for the file, for the inquiry, for the fact that it exists." Gerald's attorney said something about exposure and risk, and the limitations of what the inquiry could ultimately produce. Nathan waited for him to finish. "I'm not asking for a trial," Nathan said. "I'm asking for the truth to exist somewhere in a form that can't be undone. Whatever you do with the rest of your life, the record will say what happened on that bridge." He looked at his uncle, not with hatred, with something more difficult than hatred, the specific clarity of a person who has spent years managing something that should have been answered. "My mother made a choice to protect the family name. You made a choice to protect your position. Both of those choices had a cost. I carried it for 5 years." A pause. "The carrying is done." The admission, when it came, was limited and legally framed. It took a specific and controlled shape. But it was on the record. It existed. Gerald's board position was terminated by the end of the week. Evelyn, after a conversation with Ruth and the family's trust attorneys, voluntarily stepped back from the charitable board, pending an internal review of her decision to suppress the evidence. No public statement was issued. No press release. The family absorbed the cost in the way that families with 5 generations of practice absorb costs. Internally, completely, and without involving anyone who didn't need to know. Nathan had the power to make it a spectacle. He chose not to. The record was what he wanted. The record was what he got. 6 months after Nathan's first appointment at Cole's clinic, he stood at the parallel bars. The room was small and practical, a converted storage space at the back of the farmhouse. Good light from the west window, rubber mats on the floor. Cole stood to one side. Cassidy stood at the far end of the bar. Nathan's hands gripped the rails. His jaw was set in the particular way she had come to recognize as him deciding something rather than attempting it. He took the first step. His legs shook. Not the trembling of weakness, exactly, more the trembling of something that had been asked for years to do nothing and was now being asked for something entirely different. The scar tissue moved in ways that translated as pain through the nerves that Cole had spent months re-establishing a language with. Nathan's grip on the rails was tight. He took the second step. Cole was very still. Cassidy didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything that would interfere with what was happening, because what was happening was not a medical event, it was a decision, and the decision was his. He took the third step. He reached the end of the bars. Cassidy's hands closed around his forearms. She had moved without planning to, just caught him. The instinct of 6 months of learning to hold things that were difficult to hold. He was breathing. She was not crying. Not yet. Not while he needed her to be steady. She would do that in the car. Later, alone, she would put her forehead on the steering wheel, and she would let herself feel the whole weight of the last year. And it would not be sad, it would be something else. Something she didn't have a word for that was made of relief and gratitude and the specific joy of having been right about something that mattered. 3, Cole said quietly. Not as a verdict. As a beginning. 3, Nathan agreed. He looked at Cassidy. You said the first thing I'd do was dance with you, he said. His voice was rougher than usual. I did say that. I remember. This counts more, she said. This counts more than any of it. They drove home through the fall light. Same highway she'd driven months ago with a single sheet of paper and a decision she hadn't completely explained to herself yet. The trees along the road had turned. The air through the window was the kind of cold that felt clean rather than harsh. That evening, on the sidewalk in front of the apartment building, Nathan stood with his cane. Not walking far, the chair was still essential, would be for some time, and neither of them had any illusion about the distance between 3 steps and independence. But he was standing. On the sidewalk where she had pushed him every morning for 7 months. Where Mrs. Hendricks from the 2nd floor had started leaving soup without knocking. Where the neighbor with the ground floor garden had learned to hold the door open an extra 3 seconds without anyone asking. He stood. The street noticed. Not loudly, it wasn't that kind of neighborhood. Just a slight pause in the movement of the late afternoon, a few faces turning, a nod from the man at the hardware store across the road. Cassidy stood beside him. She didn't take a photograph. Some things you don't photograph, because the photograph would make them smaller than they are. 4 million people had watched the video from the parking garage. Most of them had laughed. The comments had said she'd lost her mind, had married a broken man, had thrown herself away on nothing. The comments were still there, mostly. Some of them had changed. A person who had posted the most liked version of "She doesn't know what she's doing" had written, 2 weeks ago, a single follow-up. I don't know how this ended, but I think about this video sometimes. Cassidy thought about that comment occasionally. She never replied to it. She didn't know what to say that the story hadn't already said better than she could. Come inside, Nathan said. I'll make the coffee. She followed him in. If you've been carrying something alone, a person's a secret, a kind of love nobody else could see, share it in the comments. Some weights weren't meant to be carried by one person, and we'll be back next time with another story that will stay with you longer than you expect. In the years that followed, people in Hollow Pine grew accustomed to the sight of 2 women at Renner's Landing. One who could not speak, and one who had finally learned to listen. They worked together through the seasons in the wordless partnership they had built, each knowing what the other needed without being told, the way people who have worked closely for a long time learn to move around each other without collision. There was no ceremony to how it happened. It was simply the daily practice of a footplace that asked to be kept. There were hard years. The kind of work the landing asked for does not get easier with telling. There was a spring the river came up higher than anyone living had seen it, higher than the old flood marks painted on the boathouse wall, higher than the line Silas had marked in the ledger in 1972 with a notation about the big water. The lower dock went under in one night, and 3 of the life rings went with it, and the current took a section of the bank that Silas had reinforced with river stones 40 years ago, as if it had been waiting all that time to reclaim it. Wren would not come in until she was sure no one was out in the water. She stood at the edge of the landing in the rain for hours, watching, one hand on the lamppost, until the water receded enough that she could be certain. And there was a winter a boy went under at the old eddy, the same eddy Silas had pulled the Pruitt boy from in 1981, and this time was different. He went down in the afternoon when the light was wrong and the current was high from the week's rain. Della heard about it that evening. She drove to the family's house. She sat with the mother for 2 hours and said almost nothing, which was what the woman needed. That night she went to the ledger. She took the pen. She wrote the boy's name in the same careful way Silas had written the 7 entries that ended with the word lost, not because it made anything better, but because to leave it out would have been a second drowning, and Silas Renner had not let the river have anyone twice, and she would not either. She had learned what those 7 entries had cost him, those 7 times the word went down in his careful square hand. She had understood it abstractly from the ledgers. Now she understood it another way. She went to the funeral. She kept the lamp lit that night as she kept it every night, because the night the lamp is dark is the night you cannot forgive yourself. But there were more of the other kind, and those were the ones that kept the record worth keeping. Young Silas Pruitt, Dale's boy, who had grown from the quiet teenager who'd helped with the dock framing into a strong, serious man, came down regularly. He had learned to swim at the landing in the safe bend above the old eddy where the current ran shallow and slow. He had learned to read the water from Wren, who had learned it from Silas, and the knowledge had passed through them the way the river passes through the same channel year after year. One flood night in early April, he swam out twice into water no sensible person would enter. The first time he brought back a woman who had been swept from the low crossing. The second time he went back for someone else, and came back alone. The water was too fast and too cold, and the dark was too deep, and he had to come back without them. He came into the boathouse soaking and shaking and sat at the table where Della was waiting. She pushed the ledger toward him. He took the pen with a hand too unsteady to keep a line straight and wrote 2 names, the one he had saved and the one he had not. Della did not correct the crooked letters or the unsteady line. "That's the truest line in the book," she told him. Lacey's daughter Renee had begun coming to the landing when she was old enough to be useful, a girl of 18 when she started, serious as faced and quick with her hands, who learned to sew life rings from Wren and Della the way Della had learned to sew everything. By watching carefully, by doing it wrong the first time, and by understanding that the quality of the work was not about showing off but about whether it held when it was needed. The set of rings Renee finished in her 2nd year were so well made that Della kept one hanging on the boathouse wall, the way another woman might frame a diploma. She didn't tell Renee that. She just left it there, where Renee could see it when she worked. 3 women of 3 generations sat mending life rings under the storm lantern. Through the autumn afternoons, Della, Wren, and Renee, the needle going up and down in a silence that was not empty but full, the way the landing itself had always been full of something that didn't have a name. The landing an appraiser had recorded as worth 0 became a place the whole town came to, not to buy or sell anything, but only to belong to something larger than themselves. People left things on the post the way they had left quarters on Silas's grave. A jar of preserves, a coil of good rope, a child's drawing of a boat and a lamp, taped to the wood with electrical tape that came loose in the rain and had to be replaced, and was replaced because the drawing was the kind of thing you replace rather than throw away. No one organized any of this. It simply happened the way water finds the low place, the way kindness, once it is shown where the channel runs, keeps running there. Della Renner lived many more years beside that river. When she was old and her hands could no longer row, she sat at the edge of the landing in the afternoons and watched Wren carry people across. Wren had become what Silas had always been, the person the river knew, the person who understood its moods and its dangers and its particular kindnesses. She had grown into the landing, the way a tree grows into the bank, her roots so deep and so old that the bank had shaped itself around her. Wren taught others, as she herself had been taught. She taught with her hands, not with words, which had always been the best way to teach the things that mattered. The knowledge passed from person to person like the current passes downstream, changing shape with the terrain but never stopping. The account that had once held only 164 never grew rich. Della was never rich. But she had come to understand, in the long years of keeping the record, something that the man in the polished black pickup would never understand. A legacy is not what we own. A piece of land can be appraised at 0. A ferry landing can rot. A bank account can drain down to loose change. But there are things no appraiser can measure, no power of condemnation can take, no number can buy. A name written down so it will not be forgotten. A hand reached out in the dark. A lamp lit every night for a stranger you will never meet. Silas Renner had left his wife a river and a set of ledgers full of people's names. It had taken his death for her to finally read them. But once she had read them, she had never stopped. And that, in the end, is all that kindness asks of us. Not wealth, not thanks. Only that we keep a place on the page for the next name. Only that we keep the lamp burning. Keep the lamp lit. No one crosses alone. If this story stayed with you, if you think Silas measured things the right way, tell us in the comments. And if you know someone who lights a lamp for others without asking for anything in return, this one is for them.